The sound was deafening, rock grinding against rock, the earth roaring as if angry at being disturbed. Georgia stumbled, hitting the cave floor hard, her palms scraping stone. Colt landed beside her, shielding her instinctively as dust and debris thundered past the entrance. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. Georgia's ears rang as she sucked in shallow breaths, her chest tight with panic. The cave was dim, lit only by a thin shaft of light struggling through the partially blocked entrance. "Are you hurt?" Colt asked, his voice low but steady. She shook her head, then realized he might not see her clearly. "No, I don't think so." He struck a match, the flame flickering to life and revealing the narrow space around them. Stone walls closed in on all sides. Dust coated everything, including Georgia's torn skirt and paint-stained hands. Colt moved to the entrance and tested the fallen rock. It didn't budge. He exhaled slowly and turned back to her. "Looks like the canyon decided we're staying a while." Georgia swallowed fear and awe tangling in her chest as she realized the truth. They were trapped together alone in Painted Canyon. With night approaching fast, the cave grew colder as the dust settled. Georgia hugged her arms to her chest, finally aware of how violently her body had been shaking since the rockslide ended. The silence pressed in on her ears, broken only by the faint whistle of wind forcing its way through the narrow opening now choked with stone. Colt knelt near the entrance, testing the rocks again with his shoulder. They didn't move. A few pebbles tumbled free, but the larger slabs held firm, wedged together like stubborn teeth. "Don't strain yourself," Georgia said softly. "You'll hurt your shoulder." He glanced back at her, surprised by her concern, then gave a small nod. "You're right. Best to wait until morning." He moved with purpose, scanning the cave floor, collecting dry brush and splintered wood that had likely washed in during old storms. Georgia watched him work, noticing how carefully he chose each piece, how he stayed alert even while doing something as ordinary as building a fire. "You've done this before," she said. "Sleeping in caves," he replied with a faint smile. "More times than I care to admit." He struck a match, shielding the flame with his hand until it caught. Soon, a small fire crackled to life, its warmth spreading through the tight space. Shadows leapt along the cave walls, transforming the stone into moving shapes. Faces, animals, memories. Georgia exhaled slowly, tension easing from her shoulders. "Thank you. I didn't realize how cold it was until now." Colt shrugged off his coat and draped it across a flat stone near her. "Sit closer to the fire. The canyon cools fast once the sun drops." "My work," she murmured. Colt followed her gaze. "I'm sorry. I didn't think." "I know," she interrupted gently. "You saved my life. That matters more." Still, her throat tightened. Each painting was time, effort, survival. Losing one felt like losing a piece of herself. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, weathered sketchbook. Its corners were bent, its pages smudged, but it was intact. Relief washed over her. "At least this survived," she said. Colt leaned closer, careful not to crowd her. "Mind if I look?" She hesitated only a moment before opening it. Pencil sketches filled the page's canyon walls. Wide skies, lone horses, standing against the horizon. They weren't perfect, but they were alive. "You don't just draw what things look like," he said quietly. "You draw how they feel." Georgia glanced up at him, surprised. "Most people don't notice that." "Most people don't look," he replied. The fire popped softly between them. Outside, the wind grew louder, threading its way through the canyon like a low song. Colt reached into his saddlebag and handed her a strip of dried meat. "It's not much, but it'll help." She accepted it, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "Why were you out here?" she asked after a moment. "This part of the canyon, I mean." "I'm a cattle scout," he said, "mapping trails, checking for trouble." She smiled faintly. "Looks like trouble found us instead." He chuckled under his breath. "Seems that way." As the light outside faded, the cave felt smaller, more intimate. Georgia wrapped her arms around her knees, staring into the fire. "I paint because places like this don't last," she said quietly. "Rock slides, railroads, fences. One day this canyon will change. I want to remember it the way it is now." Colt studied her face, illuminated by firelight. "Funny," he said. "I spend my life watching land change, never staying long enough to miss it." Their eyes met, something unspoken passing between them. The canyon settled into night, and inside the stone shelter, two strangers began to feel less like strangers at all. Night settled fully over Painted Canyon, bringing with it a cold that crept along the stone floor and climbed slowly up the cave walls. The fire Colt had built burned steadily, but its warmth only reached so far. Beyond the circle of light, shadows pressed close, deep and watchful. Georgia shifted where she sat, pulling her coat tighter around herself. The adrenaline from the rock slide had long faded, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Her body ached from the fall, from the tension of fear she had held too long without release. Colt noticed. He rose quietly and added another piece of wood to the fire, careful not to let sparks scatter. "It's going to get colder before dawn," he said. "Canyon nights always do." Georgia nodded. "I've slept outdoors before, but never like this." "Never trapped in stone?" he asked gently. She managed a small smile. "Not yet." The wind outside howled suddenly, rushing through the narrow opening with a mournful sound. The fire flickered, shadows stretching tall and thin along the walls. Georgia's breath caught before she could stop it. Colt glanced at her. "You all right?" "Yes," she said quickly, though her voice betrayed her. After a moment, she added, "I just don't like not knowing what's out there." He considered her words, then sat down a little closer, not touching, but near enough that his presence grounded the space between them. "Canyons make noises at night. Most of it's harmless. Wind, shifting stone, small animals looking for warmth. And the rest?" she asked. "If something bigger wanders close, I'll hear it." There was quiet confidence in his voice, not boastful, simply certain. Georgia found herself breathing easier. She opened her sketchbook again, turning to a blank page. Her pencil hovered as she studied the firelight, reflecting off the cave walls. "Do you mind if I draw?" she asked. "Go ahead." She began with light strokes, capturing the way the fire carved moving shapes into the stone, the way shadows bent and stretched. Her hands steadied as she worked, the familiar rhythm calming her thoughts. Colt watched her from the corner of his eye. The concentration on her face softened her features, made her seem somehow stronger and more vulnerable at the same time. He had met plenty of women in town's quick smiles, quick goodbyes, but Georgia carried herself differently, like someone who belonged to wide spaces. "What made you start painting?" he asked quietly. She didn't look up. "I grew up on a small farm, endless work, very little color. When I first saw the desert, the open land, it felt like breathing for the first time." He nodded slowly. "I know that feeling." She glanced up at him then. "What about you? Why scouting? Why not settle somewhere?" Colt stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Some folks are built for fences, others for horizons. That doesn't really answer the question." A faint smile tugged at his mouth. Maybe it's the only answer I have. The fire popped softly. Outside, something skittered across loose stone near the entrance, then vanished into the night. Georgia stiffened, but Colt didn't move. Just a fox, or a coyote, he said calmly. Nothing to worry about. She let out a slow breath. You really don't scare easily, do you? Fear keeps you alive, he replied. Panic gets you killed. She studied him, realizing how much of his life had been spent in places like this. Unforgiving, honest, demanding attention. Eventually, fatigue claimed her. Georgia closed her sketchbook and leaned back against the cave wall. Her eyes fluttered, then opened again, as another gust of wind rushed past the opening. Colt stood and removed a folded blanket from his saddlebag. He hesitated only a moment before offering it to her. You'll sleep better with this. What about you? She asked. I've done without before. She accepted it, but caught his wrist gently. Sit, please. After a brief pause, he did. They sat side by side, close enough that their shoulders brushed. Neither spoke of it, yet neither moved away. Georgia's breathing slowed as sleep finally took hold. Her head tipped slightly, resting against his shoulder. Colt froze for a heartbeat, then relaxed, allowing it. The warmth of her presence settled deep in his chest. Outside, the canyon kept its watch. Inside the shelter of stone and firelight, the long night stretched on quiet, shared and slowly changing them both. Georgia woke to light, not the harsh blaze of midday sun, but something softer pale gold, slipping through the narrow opening of the cave, brushing against stone and skin alike. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The world felt warm, steady. Then, she became aware of the weight beside her. She stiffened slightly, realizing her head rested against Colt's shoulder. Her body leaned into his in sleep. The blanket was pulled snug around her, and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Colt was awake. He stared toward the entrance, unmoving, as if he'd been carved from the canyon wall itself. When Georgia shifted, he glanced down, meeting her eyes. There was no embarrassment in his expression, only quiet awareness. Morning, he said softly. She straightened, clearing her throat. I must have fallen asleep. You needed it, he replied. You didn't move all night. She studied his face in the daylight. Without the shadows of firelight, he looked different, less severe, more human. Dust streaked his jaw, and his eyes carried the tired weight of someone who hadn't slept. You stayed awake, she asked. Most of it, he admitted. Didn't want the fire to die. Something about that settled deep in her chest. They shared a simple breakfast from what remained of his supplies, passing the canteen back and forth. The canyon outside was quiet now, as though the violence of the previous day had never occurred. Birds called faintly from somewhere above, their songs echoing down the stone walls. Colt rose and tested the rocks blocking the entrance. Again, this time several smaller stones shifted under his hands. Looks like the slide loosened overnight, he said. We might be able to clear a path. Georgia stood and joined him, rolling up her sleeves. Tell me what to move. They worked carefully, lifting smaller rocks, stacking them deeper inside the cave. Dust coated their hands and clothes. At times Colt would steady a stone, while Georgia eased it loose. Their movements grew instinctive, unspoken one anticipating the other. At one point, a rock slipped unexpectedly. Georgia lost her balance, stumbling forward. Colt caught her instantly, hands firm at her waist. They froze, breath mingling in the narrow space. You all right? He asked. Yes, she said, though her heart pounded. Neither moved right away. The closeness felt charged, not urgent, but heavy with something unsaid. Colt stepped back first, clearing his throat. Careful. The footings still loose. She nodded, though her thoughts lingered on the warmth of his hands. After nearly an hour of steady work, daylight widened at the cave's mouth. Fresh air rushed in, carrying the scent of dust and sun-warmed stone. Georgia squinted against the brightness as she stepped closer. The painted canyon stretched before them, unchanged and yet completely different. The scar of the rock slide cut sharply across the landscape, a reminder of how quickly the land could turn. Georgia felt a strange reluctance to leave the cave. "I should sketch this," she said suddenly, pulling out her pencil. The light, the break in the stone. "It's different now." Colt watched as she worked quickly, her hands sure, despite fatigue. He saw how her eyes tracked shadow and shape, how she translated what she saw into lines that meant something more. "You make it look alive," he said. "It is," she replied, without looking up. "Places breathe. They remember." When she finished, she tore the page carefully from her sketchbook and held it out to him. "For you." He hesitated. "I don't have anywhere to keep something like that safe." She smiled gently. "Then maybe it'll remind you too." He took the drawing, folding it with care and slipping it into his pocket. They stepped out of the cave together at last. The sun warmed their faces, and for a moment neither spoke. The canyon felt vast again, the shelter behind them suddenly small. Colt retrieved his horse, checking its legs and tack. Georgia gathered what supplies she could salvage, strapping them to her wagon. Everything felt slower than it needed to be, as if both of them were stretching time without meaning to. "Well, Georgia," said finally, breaking the silence, "looks like the canyon's done with us." Colt met her gaze. "Maybe not completely." She smiled at that. They weren't sure what waited beyond Painted Canyon, but they both knew something had already changed. Shaped by stone, firelight, and one long night shared in silence, the Painted Canyon stretched wide beneath the late morning sun, its colors richer now than Georgia remembered from the day before. Reds burned deeper, golds glimmered brighter, and shadows clung lovingly to the curves of stone. It was as if the land itself had shifted overnight, not in shape, but in meaning. Georgia stood beside her wagon, tightening a strap that didn't truly need tightening. Colt noticed, but didn't comment. He leaned against his horse, adjusting the reins slowly, deliberately, as though time might bend if he handled it gently enough. Neither of them was in a hurry to leave. The cave entrance loomed behind them, quiet and unassuming. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a shallow hollow in the canyon wall. No one passing by would guess what it had held fear. Warmth, watchful silence, and something fragile that had taken root in the dark. Colt broke the quiet first. "You heading back to town?" Georgia nodded. "Eventually. I still have sketches to finish. There are places like this all through the territory. I want to capture them before they're changed beyond recognition." He smiled faintly. "You're chasing something." She met his eyes. "Aren't we all?" He considered that, then glanced toward the canyon trail that wound out of sight. "I was supposed to ride east after this. New contract, different range. We're supposed to," she corrected gently. Colt exhaled, slow and thoughtful. Funny how plans feel less solid after a night like that. Georgia knew what he meant. The canyon had stripped things down to their truest shape. There had been no titles, no expectations, just a people sharing warmth and silence while the world slept. It was hard to walk away unchanged. She climbed into the wagon seat, but didn't take the reins right away. Instead, she reached into her satchel and pulled out her sketchbook one last time. Flipping through the pages, she paused at a drawing she'd finished just before dawn. Colt seated near the fire, half lit by flame, half lost in shadow. "I didn't ask before," she said, "but I'd like to turn this into a painting." He shrugged, though his expression softened. "If that's what you see when you look at me." "It is," she said simply. She tore the page free and handed it to him. "So you remember." He took it carefully, unfolding it, despite the wind tugging at the paper. For a long moment, he said nothing. "You make people look braver than they feel," he finally said. Georgia smiled. "Maybe you are braver than you think." Colt tucked the drawing safely inside his coat. Then, without quite deciding to, he stepped closer to the wagon. Close enough that Georgia could see the fine lines of dust on his skin, the steadiness in his gaze. "I don't know where I'm headed now," he said, "but I know I don't want to forget this." "Then don't," she replied. "Some places stay with you. Some people do too." The canyon wind stirred between them, warm now, carrying the scent of stone and sun. Colt reached up, resting his hand briefly against the wagon's edge, close enough that Georgia felt the quiet weight of the moment. "I ride these ranges for a living," he said. "If I find myself near wherever your light takes you." She didn't let him finish. "I'll keep a place open on the canvas." His smile was slow, genuine. He tipped his hat, then hesitated, leaning in just enough to brush a kiss against her cheek. It was soft, unhurried, and full of promise rather than demand. Georgia watched him mount his horse, the canyon framing him as he turned toward the trail. He looked back once, lifting a hand in farewell, before riding off, his figure growing smaller against the painted stone. She sat there long after he disappeared, committing the moment to memory. Then she took up the reins and turned her wagon toward the open path ahead. The painted canyon would weather storms, shifts, and time itself. It would forget the sound of falling rock and remember only the quiet after. But Georgia would remember everything, and somewhere beyond the bend of the trail, so would Colt. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Western stories.